All right, so we've talked about these three other methods that are common and that you see online. How is your approach different?
Our approach that's distinctive is we do not talk about New Testament or Jesus or Trinity or atonement. And that's like right off the bat, for Christians, they find that maybe uncomfortable because they're like, that's the stuff we're supposed to talk about.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying we don't talk about it ever, but we need to lay certain foundations first before we can get there. Okay? Just think the Bible is, Old and New Testament, right? Actually, I've got here like a Hebrew Old Testament and Greek New Testament.
Yeah.
Okay? The font's different size, but the point is you've got a lot of Old Testament before you get to New Testament.
Right.
So the Bible doesn't reveal Jesus right at the beginning, right, with all clarity, right? This is this is the plan. This is how it's going to work out. You don't have that all up front.
Right.
There's, from Moses about 1400 BC, writing the first books of the Bible up through Malachi, the last, the last prophet of the Old Testament, about 400 BC. You got 1,000 years of 39 books being written.
Yeah.
Before you even get to Jesus.
Right.
So you think about it that way, like, why do it that way?
Yeah.
It's because God was preparing people to understand the gospel. That it would seem like the gospel would not be so obviously understandable without the foundations that are laid in the Old Testament. Okay? So if we're talking to somebody who is coming from a post-Christian religion that's rejecting things that are taught in the Bible explicitly, do they even have the foundations they need to understand the gospel message? Right? I would say no. So that's why when we bring in Jesus and the cross, and it's like the Quran rejects all of it, it argues against it, and it doesn't, for them, they've been hearing about all the ways that it doesn't make sense. But they've also lost all the foundations. In fact, usually what people think of is both Muslims and Christians, actually, who haven't read the Quran. Kind of like what we hear from Muslims is that Islam says that it affirms all of the prophets in the Bible, essentially, right? Like Moses and Abraham and Isaac and Ishmael would say, Adam, Noah, David, Solomon, Jonah, Job. Now, some of those you might be thinking those aren't prophets according to the Bible.
Yeah.
But they're people in the Bible that the Quran says are prophets and would say, look, we believe in all those. So in other words, the attitude is, we believe in all the same prophets, but you guys have distorted, historically have distorted the text and deviated from the teachings, which Islam is a recovery of those pure original teachings. And those teachings what was taught by all the prophets along the line, all the way going back to Adam.
Wow.
Okay? So, what I would say is, actually, when you read the Quran, put the New Testament side of stuff aside. So in the Quran, I'm just going to kind of rough ballpark. My friend did the stats on this, like how many verses in the Quran are about New Testament stuff and how many about Old Testament. And there's something like, I'm going to be rough, about 100 verses in the Quran that are about New Testament, like Jesus, John the Baptist, John the Baptist's parents and so on, Mary. Whereas Old Testament stuff, there's like more than 1,000 verses in the Quran about people in the Old Testament, stories in the Old Testament. So why are we just talking about New Testament compared to Quran? There's more material for us to compare and to look at from Old Testament that's parallel in the Quran. And what I would say is when you read the Quran, which I do advise Christians to do, if you're going to talk to Muslims, you got to read the Quran, no question. Okay? And don't just go by what other people say. Like, try to read it for yourself. I do recommend what's called the Clear Quran, which is a translation. It has helpful footnotes and headings and stuff to understand it. So when you compare Old Testament stuff to the Quran, actually, there's so much that is different in the Quran about those Old Testament figures and events from what you read in the Old Testament.
Okay.
But Muslims have kind of got this impression that basically it's all the same.
Right.
they think the differences are mostly about Jesus and Trinity and atonement.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing that the Christians talk about.
Yes.
So what we do is we take the claim that the Quran says that it's a confirmation of the previous scriptures, the Torah and the gospel. We say, put gospel aside, let's talk about Torah.
Yeah.
Only Torah first. And that's the beginning. So we want to start with the accusation that the Bible's corrupted. Okay? Because we can compare and all of that stuff and we can argue back and forth. But if they think the Bible's corrupted, then where are we going to get?
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
So we start with essentially addressing that claim. And the Quran does say, so like just as an example,
Sure.
okay? So Surah 2, so chapter 2, let's just use like 91, okay?
Oh.
So it says, verse 91, ayah 91, it says, when it is said to them, in the context, it's said to the Jews, believe in what God has revealed, namely, believe in the Quran. They, that is the Jews, reply, we only believe in what was sent down to us, namely, the Torah.
Right.
Okay? And it says, and they deny what came afterwards, namely the Quran.
Yes.
Though the Quran, is the truth confirming their own scriptures. So it says, ask them, O prophet, that's Muhammad. So ask them, why then did you kill God's prophets before if you are truly believers? In other words, it's saying like they're being the Jews are being dishonest. And Jews in the time of Muhammad, they're saying, we only believe in what was sent down to us, namely the Torah.
Yeah.
Right? But the Quran is making a claim, it's a confirmation of the scripture you have. So if you're going to believe the Torah, you can't reject the other scripture that God sends as a confirmation of it.
Right.
That would be dishonest.
Right.
Because if it talks about that scripture and that prophet to come, then you don't really believe it if you're saying you believe it and then you reject the thing later that's confirming it. Right? It's kind of like we would say, like Old Testament, New Testament, right? Like, if I believe in Jesus, so this is a Greek New Testament, Hebrew Old Testament, okay? So mainly to illustrate that there's two different testaments. So New Testament is where we read about Jesus. So as a Christian, so like putting Islam stuff aside, I'm only going to believe Jesus is the Messiah if he actually fulfills the prophecies talked about in the Old Testament about the promised Messiah, and if he teaches in accordance with the Old Testament scriptures. Because on the flip side, if Jesus came along and contradicted the prophecies, he contradicted the law and the Torah, is he the Messiah? No, he's disqualified. What came first is Old Testament or Torah or Tanakh, right?
Sure.
Jesus, which, represented by the records of his ministry in the New Testament, is there afterwards, saying he confirms or fulfills what was there before. If he didn't do it, then he's disqualified, should be rejected, because this is already established.
Right.
And his claim is that he comes in accordance with that and confirming or fulfilling it. So if he doesn't, he's obviously contradicting himself, and therefore he should be rejected.
Right.
Okay? Usually I'll use the illustration. I'm just going to use this other book as an illustration, like the Book of Mormon, okay?
Yeah.
I don't have one with me right now. But, that's in like the 1830s or something, but with Joseph Smith Jr. So he comes along saying, here's a third testament.
Yeah.
Okay? And this was revealed to the Native Americans. Jesus appeared to the indigenous people long before the Europeans came and arrived. And here's the book, all of these revelations. And that's in accordance with the Bible, Old and New Testament. Well, when I read the Book of Mormon, it contradicts the Bible. And Joseph Smith taught things that were outright contradicting to it. So will I accept Joseph Smith? No, because he says he's confirming in alignment with something before, and he's not. So he's automatically disqualified, but also even like on its own standard, but also we've already got something established.
Right.
So like we use Old Testament to evaluate the claims of the New or Jesus, the principle is the earlier revelation is the criterion or the judge of what comes later, right? So what I usually use illustrate this sometimes with Muslims. If we just talk about the Quran as a Muslim, and this, which you might not be able to see, is a book called The Philosophy of the Teachings of Islam by Mirza Ghulam Ahmad. So this book is written by the founder of a sect of Islam called Ahmadiyya. Now, the vast majority of Muslims, Sunnis, Shia, will just outright reject this, not a true form of Islam. The Mirza Ghulam Ahmad essentially claimed that he is he's the Messiah returned.
Right.
He is Isa, Jesus returned in a spiritual sense.
What would you equate them to us as Christians?
Yeah, so we might think of the Book of Mormon, right? And Mormonism, right? So it's like an aberration or deviation from what's there. It contradicts what was there before. That's according to what Sunnis and Shia would say. Yeah. Right? There's no way that... So he comes along, he's claiming to be a prophet and Messiah, and but he comes to say he's recovering the true teachings of the Quran and correcting some incorrect things that other Muslims might have taught after the Quran, right? So it's like true Islam, okay? So is a Sunni or Shia, are they going to accept this? No. In fact, like many of them laugh at me when we talk about Ahmadiyya. Okay. I have a lot of Ahmadiyya friends, so I respect them. But the principle, what I'm trying to say is, this is a later book, a later prophet coming along. So what is a Muslim going to say? Why are they going to reject it?
Because it contradicts what's already...
It contradicts what's already there before. And the thing that they always cite is, well, there's a doctrine called the seal of prophethood of Muhammad, which is basically saying he's the final prophet. There's no more prophets after him. So Mirza Ghulam Ahmad is saying he's a prophet. He's after Muhammad. But he says the seal of prophethood is supposed to be understood differently. So he interprets that thing differently. And he's saying he's not rejecting the Quran. He's in line with it. But as soon as he's going to say, but he's not. If I actually properly understand this text, he's contradicting the teaching.
Right.
Okay? That's how they're going to... So they're going to use the already established scripture to evaluate any claimant to prophethood, right, or somebody bring another revelation to assess it, right? So similarly, if I take Old and New Testament, Quran basically claims that it's a third testament,
right,
because it's claiming to be a fulfillment or confirmation of the Torah and the Injil, the gospel.
Right.
So our approach basically says, okay, put aside the Injil, put aside the gospel or the New Testament. Let's start at the beginning.
Right.
We start with Old Testament and we compare Quran to Old Testament.
Yeah.
So we're not going to talk about Jesus and the Trinity and atonement and stuff like that in the New Testament. We're just going to talk about Old Testament stuff that's parallel with the Quran. And actually the Quran talks more about the Old Testament than it does about, or the Torah, than it does the New Testament and Jesus. Okay? So you have a lot more to compare. Now, again, we come back to that claim, but the Bible was corrupted. So the Torah was corrupted. Well, as we already saw in Surah 289 and 91, and we see a lot of other places in 241, etc. I could go on and on and on about verses that the Quran clearly teaches that the text of the Torah in the time of the Quran was not corrupted. It was reliable and uncorrupted, right, and it could be relied upon to corroborate and to check if the Quran's revelations are accurate. It can test it. That's exactly the same logic as what we would use with Old and New Testament and Jesus or any other book. So there's the confirmation. It says the Jews can recognize Muhammad in the text. That means the prophecies of Muhammad must be in the Torah in the 7th century. It's with them, so it's not confirming a book long lost before. And there's lots of other things that we could show in the Quran that teaches this and implies in many ways that the text of the Torah has not been changed. Now, what Muslims do is they will look at I could go through, there's about a handful of verses they look at that they say, no, the Quran says that it's been changed and it's corrupted.
Right.
All those verses, we don't have time to go through all of them right now, but all those verses, except for one, are either ambiguous or they clearly are saying that the Jews, or some cases is talking about the Christians as well, are distorting their scriptures with their lips or their tongue.
Right. Nothing to do with written.
It's not something written.
Right.
So if I distort the Bible with my tongue, I'm not changing the existing text. I'm explaining it wrong. I might be intentionally misrepresenting it and distorting the teachings, but distorting the teachings is not distorting the text. So interpretation and text are two different things. All of those verses are clearly or at least ambiguously about interpretation,
right,
not clearly about textual changing.
Sure.
Except one where it says in Surah 279, verse 79, it's speaking of the Jews in the time of Muhammad. It says that they wrote the book, Al-Kitab, with their own hands, claiming it's from Allah.
Right.
Meaning it's not in reality. So they wrote the book with their own hands, claiming it's from Allah. Now, if you just take that at face value, if you write a book, here's the Torah, I write a book. Did this book change?
No.
Not necessarily. It doesn't say it in saying I wrote a book, saying it's from God. I mean, maybe I wrote another book and say, here's another book from God.
Right.
And not even saying it's the same book. It doesn't say that they wrote the Torah. It just says they wrote the book. So which book? Could it be the Talmud? Could it be other Jewish writings? Could be. I think actually that's probably what is going on.
Yeah.
But it's ambiguous about which book it is. It doesn't say they changed the existing book. What is clear, though, is when.
Right.
When is it talking about? It's in response to Muhammad. So the Jews in the time of Muhammad are hearing the Quran revelation, and they're rejecting it, and they're rejecting Muhammad. Like we saw in 2 verse 89, they recognized him and yet rejected it, right? So even if they wrote even though it's ambiguous, even though, let's say it is the Torah that they wrote, and let's say they changed the existing Torahs.
Right.
It doesn't say that, but let's say they did. That's what it's meaning, which is what Muslims are claiming is what it's meaning, but that's not what it says. So even if it was that they changed the existing Torah, when did they do it?
During the
7th century in the time of Muhammad, when the Quran is being revealed. So timing is key because we have the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right.
We have the Greek Septuagint. The Dead Sea Scrolls are Hebrew copies of the Old Testament that are 1,000 years older than the oldest copies of the Hebrew Old Testament we had before they were discovered in the 1940s.
And they predate the time of Muhammad.
Long before the time of Muhammad. So, scholars date them between about 200 BC to 100 AD.
Right.
And the Quran is in the 7th century AD.
Right.
And we have, a couple copies of the Old Testament translated into Greek, called the Greek Septuagint, Codex Vaticanus, and Sinaiticus, in the 4th to 5th century AD.
Right.
So still before the 7th century AD. So in all of those, so now we've got access to the text. In fact, I usually just explain our modern English translations, so not like King James, but modern English translations are based on the best manuscripts. So that includes the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, which predate the time of Muhammad. So you can take a reliable translation in English, modern English translation that's relying on those texts, and you've got a reliable rendering of those texts that predate Muhammad.
Right.
So now we can compare modern English translation of a Greek English Bible to Quran.
Right. So ultimately what you're trying to do when you're talking to a Muslim is going back to the Quran and saying, this is what your Quran is claiming.
Yeah.
Right? That it is a confirmation of the old, the scriptures that the Jewish people had. And now you get them up to this point, and then you always ask that key question, right? Like, when do you think it was corrupted?
Before actually getting into all those verses, we would usually start a conversation by asking them, do you think the Hebrew Old Testament, the Hebrew Torah, was changed and corrupted?
Right.
And sometimes Muslims don't know what to say because they all they've heard is that the Bible's been corrupted. But the Old Testament isn't really about the Trinity and Jesus and stuff like that. So those are the doctrinal differences that they know are contradicted in the Quran. But Old Testament, it seems like it's all the same, or like what is it that's different?
Right.
which is immediately why there's an advantage of also using Old Testament comparison, because they don't have their back up to like be defensive.
Right.
Because there's nothing obvious that they need to defend against. Okay? So when then we ask the question, so if let's say they believe that's been changed. Okay. So we say, when do you believe it was changed? Was it before Muhammad or after Muhammad?
Right.
And so, often they don't know because their concept of the Bible being changed and corrupted is like an abstract idea. They because they know that there's stuff in it that contradicts the Quran, and the Quran must be from God, so therefore the Bible must have been changed. We don't know when, we don't know how exactly, but it's not reliable. We've got the reliable one that's been perfectly preserved. We got the Quran, so we just go with that. I don't even need the other one.
Right.
Okay, that's the thinking that they have, and but the Quran says that it confirms what came before, and it can be checked, like whether the Quran is true based on whether it confirms what's before.
Right.
Now, if the Old Testament can actually be checked according to even the Quran's own standard, then now we can compare them, right? So since the Quran says that it confirms the Old Testament or the Torah in that time, and we've got manuscripts that long predate it, now we can compare it. Right? So we should expect that they should match when they overlap.
Right.
So when they're talking about the same things, they should not be contradicting. Just like we would say Jesus doesn't contradict Old Testament. If he did, he'd be disqualified.
Yeah.
Right? Or the Book of Mormon would be disqualified because it is not corroborated by the Bible. Contradicts it. A couple other verses I wanted to share. So we mentioned that, like in 7:157, it says that Muhammad is prophesied in the Old Testament. So Muslims understand that, or when they think about the Quran confirming the previous scriptures like the Torah, they think primarily that there's prophecies of Muhammad in those texts, and maybe those got tampered with over time, and that's what got corrupted. So what they're thinking is that's really what's being fulfilled or confirmed. But actually, the Quran talks about more than that being confirmed. And this is an area that they usually don't know about, and this is at the core of our approach.
Okay.
So Surah 10, verse 94 says, if you, O Prophet, that's Muhammad, if you, O Prophet, are in doubt about these stories that's Allah, that we have revealed to you, then ask those who read the scripture before you. The truth has certainly come to you from your Lord, so do not be one of those who doubt. So now the context of this is verse 94. From verse 71 to 93, there's essentially like three major figures that are talked about in stories that are recounted in this passage in the Quran.
Okay.
Talks about Noah and then Moses and Pharaoh. Now, where are those in the Bible?
Genesis and Exodus.
Genesis and Exodus, which is part of the Torah. So here it's saying, if after recounting those stories, it says, if you're in doubt about, now this Quran, this translation says, if you're in doubt about these stories, it adds in these stories. But I would say that's a fair rendering to explain what the meaning and the context, because you just finished talking about these stories that are cited in the Quran. So you're saying, so then if you're in doubt about these stories that Allah has revealed in the Quran, then ask those who've been reading the scripture before you.
Which in this case would be the Jewish people.
Right. So that means they can go check it. Another implication that it's reliable in the time of Muhammad. Otherwise, how could you reliably tell people to go ask the Jews to check their scriptures to see if the stories in the Quran match?
Right.
If it was corrupted.
Yeah. They must have had a physical copy, and the Quran is saying that it's reliable.
And specifically, what should be corroborated? The stories of the Prophet. Yeah. So it's not just the prophecies of Muhammad. that means that we can compare the stories because the Quran expects them to match.
Right.
And this is another verse I use at the end of Surah 12, verse 111. After it gives the long account of the story of Joseph in the Quran, it's talking about the prophets and messengers. It says, in their stories, in the stories of the prophets and messengers, there is truly a lesson for people of reason. This message, which is talking about the Quran, this message can't be a fabrication. Why can the Quran not be a fabrication? It says, rather, it is a confirmation of previous revelation, a detailed explanation of all things, a guide and a mercy for people of faith. So what it's saying here is that the stories of the prophets are being confirmed in the Quran as you would find them in the previous scriptures. So where there's overlap, we don't expect them to say all the same information about it, like an exhaustive account, but we would expect when it repeats it, it's not going to contradict. And it even says it's a detailed explanation. In verse 3 in Surah 12, it says, God says to Muhammad, we relate to you, O Prophet, the best of stories through our revelation of this Quran, though before this you were totally unaware of them. This is, I like to explain to Muslims, though, this is something I actually appreciate about the Quran, because the Quran is giving us an objective basis to make an evaluation. It's not subjective. It's not about feelings. Like sometimes if you watch stuff like or talk to Muslims, they'll say the Quran gives a test about the Quran is a literary miracle and, you know, you can't produce a surah or verses like it. So, but here, that's kind of subjective, right? How do you even compare that? But here it's saying Muhammad didn't know the stories before that are revealed in the Quran. After all, we read in Surah 7, 157 that he's unlettered, meaning he's illiterate, so he can't read. It means he doesn't have access to read the biblical text, the Torah. So he can't know by reading it. He would only know, let's say he asked some Jewish people to tell him the stories. But here the claim is in the Quran, he didn't do that and he doesn't know the stories. So now he's about to give from verse like 4 from verse 4 to like 101, so like almost 100 verses, a long story about the account of Joseph, almost 100 verses in all sorts of details. And the expectation, according to the Quran, is that it should match the story in the Torah. It's not going to contradict it, because if it contradicted it, how is it a confirmation of that story? You can't just say that it's a general confirmation in the sense, they both talk about Joseph. They both talk about Joseph going into a well. Okay. Yeah, it follows a lot of the same general storyline, but it does contradict in many places, and in all sorts of details that seem like they don't matter. But the Quran says it's a detailed explanation and confirmation of the stories. So, after all, if Allah is the author of both the Quran and the Torah, before it was corrupted, which we have according to the Quran, okay, then they shouldn't contradict each other, because it should be the same divine author behind both of them according to the Quran. So, lo and behold, when we compare the stories, so then we compare the stories. We explain the stuff, we explain the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then we start comparing the narratives. So just as one quick example in the story of Joseph, the beginning of the account in Surah 12 in the Quran, it says that Joseph has a dream of a sun, moon, and 11 stars, and he tells the dream to his father, Jacob. And Jacob says, hey, don't tell your brothers, because then, this is my paraphrase, by the way, but it's accurate. But because then Satan's going to come along and sow a seed of jealousy between you and your brothers. So then Joseph never tells his brothers the dream. But in Genesis, the parallel account of this is in Genesis 37, where he has two dreams. The first dream he tells his brothers, that's the dream that's not in the Quran, which is just an omission. It's not a contradiction. But then the second dream he has, which is in the Quran, the sun, moon, 11 stars, he tells his in Genesis he tells his brothers first, then he tells his brothers again with his father, and then his father, it says, rebukes him and says, "What, are we going to fall down and bow down before you, and you're going to rule over us?" So he's upset by the dream, the father. He rebukes him. And who did he tell the dream to? He told it to, in Genesis, he told his brothers and his father. And in the Quran, he doesn't tell his brothers, and he only tells his father. And his father isn't upset. His father warns him because he recognizes this is a prophetic dream that Allah gave to Joseph. So it's essentially, he's happy. But he's concerned, so he gives a warning. So the point is, there's multiple contradictions even in this couple verses right at the outset. And this is how it goes all the way through, every verse after verse, and all of, not only this account of Joseph, but every single account of Adam and Noah and Moses and Abraham and so on. So that you probably, there's hundreds and hundreds of contradictions in all these details, and in every single story there's contradictions between the Quran and the parallels in the Old Testament.
Right.
We're not even talking about Jesus or the Trinity or the atonement. And when we don't, why I don't get to Jesus, because I want to talk about Adam and Noah and Moses, all of these people before I get there, to explain to me how you can, how do you account for these differences that are clear contradictions? And so you have to think that for the Muslim, they're going to have to think, well, the Torah must have been changed, because otherwise the Quran is false.
Exactly.
According to its own criteria.
Right.
So some way it had to have been corrupted. So that's why, and this is also why it's so important to go through some of the accounts with them and compare it in detail, because then they will see for themselves all of the contradictions that are almost every verse is a contradiction. And they're in these details. So it's now they're starting to starting to see the specific things that are contradicted, that if they were to still maintain the claim that the Torah must have been changed, it would have had to have been changed before the Dead Sea Scrolls. Why, I don't know. But even has a 1,000-year history of reliable transmission between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the oldest manuscripts that we had before that. So we have evidence of reliable transmission for a long period of time. So why would we just presume? We have no evidence that it was changed before then. We only have evidence of reliable transmission. But then you have to say, okay, so when we're faced with all these specifics, like the example I gave about Joseph telling his brothers and his father in Genesis, but only his father and not his brothers in the Quran, that means that for the Islamic claim of corruption of the Torah to be true, that means originally Genesis, in the story of Joseph, before it got changed, had to have read like the Quran. So that in its original account, Genesis must have said that Joseph only told his father the dream, and his father warned him not to tell his brothers the dream. And he never ended up telling the dreams. Which, you keep reading it, it just gets harder and harder, because, in Genesis, when they spot him coming from afar off, they see him at the edge of the field and they say, "There's that dreamer. Let's get him and kill him." Well, they know the dreams. So it's saturated in the story. You can't just change it in one place. It affects wherever it's mentioned again in other places. So not only is it just this can't be accounted for by an unintentional change. Over time it got changed, it got translated, it got copied, and so by accident a scribe kind of that dropped out of the text because they missed a line or something like that by accident. That's not how textual transmission works when we're talking about things like this, because there's too many of them, and the way that it's not like one word changed, right? Or they accidentally skipped a line, and then when we compare manuscripts, we can see where they skipped the line, right? This would require intentional change. Then we have to ask ourselves, what possible motivation could they have to change it?
Right, because the details that are being changed seem pretty insignificant.
Right. And actually, this is why I think Christians don't talk about it.
Yeah.
Some of the Christians who read the Quran and do apologetics with Muslims, they talk about the big things. They talk about the gospel, they talk about theology and doctrine, and say, stop talking about doctrine, talk about details.
Right.
Details, not doctrine, because it's in the details that actually you find whether it stands up to scrutiny. And it's in the details that you have no motivation to change them. Theology would provide a motivator to change. So if you change your theology and you wanted your scripture to reflect the change in theology, hypothetically, not to say that they would do it, but hypothetically, you can imagine that as a motivation to change, tamper with the scriptures.
Right.
Okay? But what motivation would the Jews have to tamper with the scriptures when it's not theologically driven? They're not changing a doctrine or theology, and that's why they changed the story. There's nothing about whether Joseph told his brothers a dream or didn't tell his brothers a dream that changes theology. It's also not about ethics or morality. So it's not like, oh, well, now that because the Jews, they decided they wanted to make their hero look better. Right. So now they wanted to embellish it and make him look better. Right. So they changed him from looking worse to better. Now that is actually something that you could imagine as a hypothetical change in a document. But the problem is that we would have to deal with the reverse direction of that change, because the Quran presents it as, well, one, this is not even an ethical issue. It's not an ethical issue whether he tells his brothers or he tells his father, right? The dream. So it's not about making him look better or looking worse, but actually what's interesting is when you do compare more of the stuff in the stories, something that stands out to Muslims when they first are exposed to biblical accounts of people that they regard as prophets, some of them we don't regard as a prophet, but they're major people in the Bible, like Abraham, or Lot. Like Lot's a very significant example. Like, in Genesis, his daughters get him drunk and they sleep with him, right? Like a crazy thing. Or like him trying to give up his daughters.
Yeah.
When the people of Sodom are trying to rape the angels, right?
Yeah.
Who are in a human form. So like he offers up his own daughters. Like that's pretty horrible.
Yeah.
So the Quran's account's different than that. It makes Lot look a lot better. So which would make sense because the Quran is so much later. So its version of the story makes them look better.
And the way Muslims see prophets is like they're the standard of morality. Exactly.
It's different than the biblical view of prophets, which is basically they're essentially covenant enforcers. And in the Bible, God reveals covenants, and then prophets are tasked with the responsibility to remind God's people, like Israel, about the covenant promises and warn them if they violate the requirements of the covenant, the laws, then these curses will come upon the people and so on. So prophets are not there to be moral examples to the people. They're not chosen because they're so moral and righteous. The Bible is very clear. No one is righteous. Everybody's a sinner. Everybody needs salvation, including the prophets. So the only sinless one in the Bible is Jesus.
Right.
When you have that understanding of an Islamic view of a prophet as essentially sinless, like they're not exactly 100% sinless, but basically, and their role is to be moral examples to the people. They're like the ideal human being to follow. So obviously then if that's their role, then they can't be sinning in any severe way, because then they wouldn't be moral examples to humanity. Right? And God wouldn't choose them for that reason. So when a Muslim reads about things like the story of Lot and his daughters, and they're like, Lot is a prophet. I mean, for us, we're like, he's not really a prophet.
Yeah.
But, and they like, a prophet can't do that. So like, there must be something wrong with this book, because prophets don't do that.
Yeah.
So, but here we think about it, that would require the Torah today, and actually even the Dead Sea Scrolls, to have been changed by the Jews to make their prophets look worse. Because if the Quran's version was the original version, the Torah. Lot wasn't doing those things, and David wasn't sleeping with Bathsheba and stuff like that, right? So that means they weren't doing those bad things, those sinful things, and now the Jews change it to make them so that they were doing it,
right?
As we have it in our Bible now,
right?
So why would the Jews make their heroes of the faith and prophets and kings that they look up to look worse and more sinful? It only makes sense if they're going to tamper with it, they're going to embellish them to make them look better,
right?
Because they're their heroes. Now, one imam once tried to explain, well, because the Jews are really corrupt and they're evil, they want to make their heroes of the faith look worse because they make them more sinful so that it will justify them following their example and being more sinful.
Yeah.
Now, I think this is obviously preposterous, crazy, and maybe anti-Semitic too. But that aside, even if I took that explanation, as crazy as that might sound, that's contradicted, because in the Torah, so let's say they changed the stories. They wanted them to be more sinful, so it will justify them in living sinful lives. The problem is the Torah has something else other than stories. It has the law code.
Right.
The law code condemns Abraham for lying. It condemns Lot for sleeping with his daughters. It condemns David for sleeping with Bathsheba and orchestrating Uriah's murder, right? None of those laws change.
Right.
So why would they change the stories to make them look worse? Because they are looking worse according to the law, because the law doesn't change. So they kept the laws that condemn the behavior that are actually the standard. So this is the thing is, they think the prophets are the standard for moral conduct.
Right.
It's not the prophets, it's the law. That's our standard.
Right.
But they didn't tamper with the law.
So they would have changed the prophets and not tampered with the law that actually condemns what the prophets were doing.
It only further condemns them. So it doesn't fit with the idea that they made them look worse to justify the Jews being able to live more sinfully.
So ultimately, there's really no motivation for the Jewish people to have tampered with the Torah the way that we have it now.
Right, because unintentional won't account for all the changes,
right,
and the nature of the changes. Theological motivation isn't there,
yes,
because these are, as you said, they're insignificant details. They're not about atonement and Jesus' divinity and the Trinity and stuff like that. And they're not about morality primarily. They're not, especially not making them look better, right? So what possible motivation would you have to change these details?
Right.
So you're left with, there is no good explanation. That's the point, because there was no tampering in that way.
Right. So now you're sitting with a Muslim. You've gotten to the point where you've overcome the hurdle of the time frame of when the Quran or when the Torah could have been corrupted. And now you're starting to get into some comparisons. Now, I remember you saying a great analogy of the Quran's claim of it being the confirmation of the Torah being like a bag. And then as you're starting to do these comparisons with the prophets, it's like you're adding these little small rocks in it. The more differences there are in the narratives, the heavier that bag gets.
Yeah.
It's ultimately...
Yeah, it ultimately breaks, it bursts. And the idea there's a couple of things I could say about that. It would be good to express. One is that, put yourself in their shoes if you can, right? Imagine it was the reverse. Somebody's bringing this about the Bible. Somebody finds looks like there's a contradiction there, right? Which people do that, right? Okay, so, and you might be let's say you walk away and you're like, the one I couldn't figure out the answer to. Sure. Now, are you going to just abandon your faith? No, because you're going to think, maybe I don't know the answer. There's probably an answer to it somewhere.
I reconcile.
I found all these answers to all the other things. There's something I'm missing. I could even give you an example, one I struggle with for a time, but the point is, it actually took research for me, one example, that on my mind, I won't give it, but It took me time to find it. Had to look in the Hebrew. I had to compare different parallel passages, and eventually I found the answer. I'm like, oh, okay, that's it. Like, but it took me time to figure it out.
Sure.
Sometimes, like, that's really hard to do, or you might not find. Sometimes it's not. You might not find out what is the answer, but the answer, there might be an answer.
Yeah.
So if it's only like one thing, it's probably not enough weight for you to be like, yeah, I'm going to abandon it all.
Right.
So for a Muslim, there's similar for Christians, like you're going to abandon all of your faith. So that means we have to understand that they have to have really good reason to say, yes, the Quran is not from God and Islam is actually not true. I need to follow the truth.
Right.
They need to have a lot of weight behind that to be very confident that that's the case, right? So one detail, one contradiction, they might think, well, maybe we don't know how the Torah was corrupted that way, but there maybe somehow they changed it. I don't really know how.
Right.
The problem is once we start multiplying those details of contradictions to dozens and dozens and hundreds, now we're not talking about something that can be accounted for, right? So this is why the specifics matter. Like, as I was saying at another point, their idea of biblical corruption is that it's an abstract idea. They don't know specifically what was changed. They just know what's been changed. We know some teachings are different, but they don't realize that all the stories are radically contradictory.
Right.
And so there being no good explanation, and not only that there's no explanation, but we can see the transmission of the text long predates Muhammad.
Right.
And any manuscript you find, this is the thing, doesn't matter if it's before Muhammad, after Muhammad, in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, Ethiopic, doesn't matter, Samaritan Pentateuch, Latin Vulgate, doesn't matter what text you look at, in the original or in translation at any time, the stories are the same. Joseph, there's no different story of Joseph. And guess what? There's never a version of the story like the Quran of any of those people. So what I'd like to see is for the Muslim, what they have to do really is produce one manuscript that has the stories like the Quran.
Wow.
In the Torah, of the Torah,
Yeah.
Right? They can't do it. It's impossible because it never existed.
So it's such a different approach, because in the way that I used to evangelize to Muslims before understanding this, I would be sitting there talking about the Trinity, divinity of Jesus, all these things. But I'm backed up against the wall trying to explain these doctrinal things.
And what I would say is, we are putting the Muslim on the defensive, but we're not being offensive about it, right? Like, we're just talking about facts, and like the Quran says it's a confirmation of the Torah in these specific ways. So then when we check, why isn't it?
Right. It's a sincere question to a claim that the Quran is making.
Now, I want to deal with the text accurately. So I am actually differing with them for the most part and what most Muslims understand about what the Quran teaches about the reliability of the Torah.
Right.
But I think anybody who reads the Quran closely, with an attention to the detail about those verses, without bringing with it preconceived notions about how they're supposed to interpret it from teachers, imams, apologists, from their camp, that they know that the Quran contradicts the Bible. So obviously, if it's reliable, then the Quran is undermined.
Right.
So it has to be corrupt or they lose everything, right? So we want to make this case really strong for them, because we also know that for them, there is such a great cost for them to abandon Islam and to follow Christ. Many Muslims lose connection with their family, can even be violently persecuted. They lose their social networks, their extended family sometimes. Actually can send a ripple effect through their whole family, extended family. So we have to be recognizing that when we're asking them really to consider whether Islam is false and the Bible is true, that there is such a great cost that this is why, like, don't just share the gospel.
Right.
Help them to see why the Quran is actually not reliable, why the Bible is reliable,
Right.
and the hope that they have in Christ, and that it is worth even losing everything over it.
Okay.
If you're not really sure, why would you abandon it, right?
Yeah.
Add on to that, just to maybe wrap it up more, is so essentially what I was explaining is essentially dismantling the authority of the Quran, right? So they believe the Quran is divine authority, so anything that contradicts it would be trumped by it, right?
Right.
So if we show according to its own standards, it doesn't live up to its own standards and it undermines itself because it appeals to the Torah and the Torah contradicts it, then now the Quran is out. It's not the authority. We've been in the process of us doing that. We've exposed them to the Old Testament, right? So now they're starting to see the Bible, which the Quran pointed them to,
right,
in the Old Testament in particular. And so what we then want to do is we want to relay the foundations of the Old Testament before we get to Christ and the gospel.
Right. Because you mentioned in previous conversations that they don't have a system of sacrifice or atonement.
Yeah, so all of the foundations of the gospel, for you to understand the gospel, which are laid in the Old Testament, are eroded and distorted in the Quran. They don't have biblical covenants, not in the same way that the Bible teaches about them. So there's no progressive plan of salvation. This is the thing, is like, this is very different. In Islam, there is no plan of salvation. For Christians, it's like unthinkable. Like,
Right.
There's a plan of salvation, in particular, that especially starts with Abraham. You can even look at the seed of the woman with Adam, but the Abrahamic covenant, and then that blossoms into the covenant promises to Moses, and the covenant promises to David, and then the promise of a new covenant that's mentioned in Jeremiah and the prophets, and then that's fulfilled in the new covenant of the Messiah with Jesus. And that all builds and builds and builds. There's adding on more and more and more, and it comes to its fulfillment.
Right.
And they all work together. So there's a plan that's building that God is working out over history.
Right.
In the Quran, it's not a plan of salvation. It's he sends prophets to this people and to that people, and again later on to remind them of God's will, to say, look, you got to be following God's will. You've turned away from him. Maybe you followed idols or you fall into the sin. This is God's law, his will. The prophet brings a book of Revelation, and also he exemplifies it in his own person because he's a moral example. So follow my example.
Right.
So it's essentially the message of Islam is there's one God who created all things. Don't worship idols. Don't attach anything to him. Don't associate anything with him. There's only one God. And that God doesn't come into the world. There's no incarnation.
Yeah.
All he asks of us is to believe in him, to repent of our sin, to do good deeds, and to trust in his mercy.
Awesome. Well, this is really good, and I'm sure we can, go on and chat more about this method. But I think you've gotten through like
we've gone through some of the major things.
Yeah.
Got an idea of the approach.
I know people are probably listening to this and saying, this is really good content. I'm sure there's a lot more we can dive into. Where can they find you?
As this video is airing, you might be watching this much later, but I'm starting up a channel of my own with a friend of mine, Daniel. And so when this comes out, our channel should be up and running, but we're not going to have a lot of content on there yet.
Okay.
But if you can go and subscribe to it, it's called Until All Here, which is talking about in Romans 15, 20, 21, talks about, I make it my ambition not to preach the gospel where Christ's name has been named.
Mm-hmm.
And then he quotes Isaiah 53, which talks about, the passage that the news will be heard, that those who have not heard will hear, right? So it's the idea that our responsibility is to bring the gospel to all the nations until all hear.
Amazing.
So that's what our channel is about. So on the channel is not just going to be like apologetics content. We do plan to talk like theological stuff, but also we're planning to have lots of interviews and interactions, respectful conversations with people of other religious backgrounds, including religious leaders. So it's not just like an argument stuff or debating. So love to catch you over there.
Awesome. And while they're subscribing to that, they could also find you on your website, because you're also a pastor and you run a church.
Yeah, so it's called Saturate Church. SaturateChurch.com is the website. You can email us through that website, contact us through there. So love to hear from you. If you're in the GTA, the Greater Toronto area, we meet in homes and stuff, and in Mississauga. So would love to have you join us if you're looking for a church.
Amazing. Well, Pastor Greg, thank you so much for joining the podcast today, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.